Hello, thank you so much for tuning in to Leader Tips by E. My name is Ebony Butler, and I'm excited that you've joined. Today, we're actually going to be starting on to our episode 5, where we're going to spend some time talking about how do we leverage our voice in the workplace. And particularly when I say we, I am talking about women, and I'm also talking about women of color. So all women, we experience this, and also women of color. Of course, it's probably going to resonate even more. Remember, the things that I talk about on my videos are basically just off of Ebony's experiences. And so feel free to take what applies to you and what you can resonate with, and everything else, just leave it behind. Don't even worry about it. Just leave it behind. How often have you been told that you're too aggressive in meetings? How often have you been told that maybe you come across emotional or also controlling? I'm sure a lot of you have experienced that and probably even have heard that before, and that's why we're going to spend time talking about it. Today, we're going to talk about the root of all of that. And the root of all of that is biases in the workplace, particularly gender biases, prototyping biases, as well as stereotypes. We're also going to spend some time talking about what do you do when you're faced with it? And specifically today, we're going to talk about what do you do when you're faced with this bias on how people might feel that your voice doesn't have much play in a certain space at work. And so I'm ready for us to go ahead and dive right in. Let's talk about gender biases for a minute. We're going to talk about how it shows up at work. And we're going to also talk about how do you leverage your voice and how do you do it in a unique and productive way. The first thing is, what is a gender bias? Gender bias is really when there is a favoritism or someone has different things that they're probably able to do, and it truly is because of their gender. And gender bias can go either way. It could be gender bias for women or against women, for men or against men. And today, for the purpose of our time, we're going to talk about when the gender bias is for men, where men's voices are heard in the boardroom. Men's voices are the ones that make all the decisions. And so that's going to be the primary focus of our time today. I was reading an article, and I love to read like Harvard Business Review, and they did an article that showed, believe it or not, so first off, let me pause and say this. A lot of times when they do studies around gender biases in the workplace, a lot of times they target industries that are predominantly men. So maybe construction, or something like that. So they choose industries that are predominantly men. And so it almost, obviously the gender bias shows up, and it is a predominantly male-run organization or industry. Well, HBR, Harvard Business Review, they did a study that showed that like 4 of the top female dominating industries also experience gender bias, and it's gender for men. And that was really odd to me. So like healthcare, they experience gender bias for men. Also like higher education, where it's predominantly dominated by women. That's also, they experience biases as well, even law and even like in nonprofit spaces. And so this is something that is all around us. Just to give some solace with this though, I want us to kind of understand the origin of it and where it comes from. Gender bias shows up at work a lot of times because we were raised up that way. Now, what I am not saying, I'm not saying that everyone was raised up with this. And for the most part, particularly if you were born like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, perhaps, there were like these gender roles, right? So boys were supposed to be aggressive. They were supposed to be vocal. They were supposed to be loud. And girls were supposed to be cute. We were supposed to be passive, and we were supposed to be meek. And a lot of times that same way we were raised up tends to shine and show up for us at work. So how does it show up? For me specifically, it shows up when I have to couch what I need to say. Now, let me tell you this. For a long time in meetings, especially if there were a lot of men, I would start to tune out. And the reason I was tuning out was because honestly, I was thinking to myself, I have a thought, and how am I going to take this thought out of my head and articulate it in a way that's not going to be perceived as combative or not going to be perceived as I'm angry or I'm overly emotional. And so I would spend probably 4 minutes in my head when I'm supposed to be tuning into the details of the meeting to think about how am I going to express myself. So that's one thing. We as women, we tend to couch our thoughts, couch our statements before we say them. We also intentionally downplay our accomplishments, and we've done that many, many times before. You hear about this thing called ego, and most of the time when you hear about ego, you think about men. And so we as women sometimes are thinking, well, how do I highlight my accomplishments without downplaying them, particularly in male-dominating workspaces? And I found myself to do that as well. I found that I would typically downplay all of my accomplishments to continue to stroke the ego of my male counterparts. And then, of course, one other thing that we tend to do, or I know used to happen to me, is I was constantly interrupted in meetings. And as I was thinking about this video, it's not to give a pass. I'm not giving a pass for this. And I started thinking about everything that we do is based on a thoughts that we have and maybe how we were raised. And so if we were raised to be seen and not heard, maybe the men were talking over me because maybe something about me didn't come across as confident. Maybe I sounded passive. Maybe I used words that displayed a lack of confidence, like I think it could. Maybe I wasn't given direct eye contact. I don't know. Listen, I'm trying to give them a pass. Well, really not, but I'm trying to. And so I do know that just being cut off at times was another one of those big things I used to experience. And of course, it used to frustrate me a great deal. The common theme to all of these is about communication. And sometimes our voice is not heard intentionally or unintentionally. And what we want to do today is focus on what are some things we can do when our voice is not being heard. We're going to talk about 4 different instances. What happens when you're interrupted? What happens when someone else is interrupted? What happens when you want to be proactive to avoid interruptions? And then the last one will really be, how do you then follow up with the interrupter and give them feedback? So let's talk for a minute about what happens when you are interrupted. 3 steps. The first step is for you to take a deep breath. I know that that sounds insignificant. I know that that sounds like it's too easy. And I really encourage you to take a breath. There is so much power in a breath. And I am saying you can be as dramatic as you want. It is so much power there. The reason it's power there is because it prevents you from being reactive, and it allows you an opportunity to have a clearer brain, a clearer way to think. And so now you show up as a responsive person versus reactive. When you show up reactive, you're overly emotional, you're not sticking to the facts. People tend to not take you seriously. And when you're showing up and you're responsive, people tend to take you seriously. So the first thing I would say is to take a deep, deep breath. Then you need to say something. And I want you to use these 2 statements with caution, because I am Ebony, you are who you are. You have to do what makes you happy and what makes you feel comfortable. The challenge is that you have to confront it and you have to say something. And so it could sound something like this. I would love to finish what I was saying. You haven't even heard the best part. That's what Ebony would say, especially if there really is a best part. And you could change it up if there's really not a best part. Another thing you could say is, may I please finish? I haven't even completed my full thought. So you want to say something. So you take a deep breath. And people might say, well, Ebony, why would you give them space to say something? Because when you follow up with that question and you follow up and say something, you want it to be heard. And so I invite that pause when you're taking your deep breath, in order for when you finally make your statement, it captures the attention in the room. People pause and they pay attention to what you just said. And then complete your thought. So once again, if you're interrupted, I encourage you to take a deep breath, inhale, exhale. I encourage you to say something. May I please continue? I hadn't finished my thought. And then you give your thought. At the end of the day, it is about respect, and it is also about you being very clear on what you expect. And so it is so okay, even though I know it's different for us, it is so okay for us to refocus the conversation back to where it matters most with you, because you were talking and you were interrupted. What happens when someone else is interrupted? I encourage you to be an advocate. And the great thing about that is that it will allow everyone else to recognize that not only do you not want to be interrupted, you also want other people to be respected. It also refocuses the conversation and gives that person back the floor. It could sound something like, Stacy, you were saying something really important. Please continue. Still pause first, take a breath, and then say something. And that will truly teach people how to interact with you. It is okay for us to do that. And we can do that using tact and also being confident and moving forward. It's about respect. What do you want to do to be proactive? So maybe you're in an organization or you're on a team where this is the way it goes. Every Wednesday, people are talking over people. And this could apply for anyone. Men talking over women, women talking over men. It doesn't matter. It's just a lot of talking over, a lot of interruptions. You could set the tone. Today during our meeting, we are going to share all the details that are pertinent to this project. And we're going to save 5 minutes at the end for whatever questions, thoughts, or additional pieces of information you want to provide. I highly encourage you to use that notepad we placed there, and you can take notes so that we can prevent from interrupting our speaker, get all the data and facts, and then have a fluid conversation towards the end. Let's get started. You have to set the tone. And then the last piece is about giving feedback. I am such a strong promoter of giving feedback. I truly feel that it is everyone's responsibility, whether or not you have a leader title or not. It is your responsibility to give feedback. Some of you probably have heard of the feedback model, SBI, Situation, Behavior, Impact, and I am a fan of it. You give the feedback to the interrupter, and you also can give feedback in a group setting if it is a group that needs to hear the feedback. If it's a 1 or 2 off, then I highly encourage you to not penalize the full group. I expect, or I would recommend you to stand up, be confident, and really address it with that person head on. You tell them the situation, the behavior, and the impact it had. The situation could be, these last couple of weeks in meetings and team meetings on Wednesdays, the behavior, I recognize that you interrupt most of the people whenever they're talking. The impact, what that does is it causes confusion. It causes the person that was speaking to lose confidence and shut down. And guess what? We don't get an opportunity to hear the rest of the thought. My recommendation, or what I would like to see going forward, is for us to allow everyone to speak freely. And when they pause and they finish their thought, then we add additional context. How does that sound to you, John? I hope you all have walked away with at least 2 golden nuggets from today. We've talked about biases and how it shows up at work, particularly as it relates to interacting with men in the workplace. We've talked about how to leverage your voice for yourself as well as for others. And we've also spent some time talking about how do you give feedback using the SBI feedback model. Thank you so much. If this video was important or you enjoyed this video, if you have not done so already, please click the subscribe button, because I would love for you to subscribe to the channel. If you have questions, thoughts, or insights, feel free to always leave a comment. I'm looking forward to those. And thank you all so much, because next video, we're going to be talking about how do you leverage your voice for negotiations. You all have a great day. Goodbye.